So 58% poverty overall. We're looking today at 76%. We're looking
now Miguel Tinker Salas quoted what, the World Bank, these institutions.
Yes, there were times in 2010 and 29 when the price of oil was really high and Chavez was borrowing massively and spending money in patronage. And this is one of the problems here. The problem is that, yes, 10% of the population, the hardcore Chavistas, were going out and taking advantage of the social programs. In other words, the problem is that what the opposition wants to do is generalize these programs. These programs are not protected by the Constitution. They're the initiative of a president, of an executive. And so what the opposition wants to do is, for instance, it wanted to give titles to the people in the mission, the great mission, the housing mission of Venezuela, so that the people would no longer be forced to go out and march in demonstrations for the government or vote for the government, feel obliged to support the government in many different ways. This is how populism works. And I'm sorry it offends Miguel that populism is such an important part of Latin American politics, and but that's the way it is in Latin America, and that tends to be the way it works in a lot of places in the world. When you have strong leaders who give patronage to their supporters and keep it from the sectors that are in opposition to them.
Miguel Tinker Salas, has that been a problem, do you think, with Maduro now and Chavez before, and picking who gets the benefits?
The social programs, mission for housing, for food, etc. You don't show a PSUV card to walk into a mercal. I've walked into a mercal. I do not have a PSUV card. You have a cédula, which is your national ID card, which every Venezuelan has. You don't show a PSUV card to receive medical benefits, to receive eye care, to buy a book at 1 Bolivar, which is basically free, to be able to gain access to the entire network. This is again part of the discourse of the right-wing opposition in Venezuela, that somehow only, because again they think that a popular sector's ability to actually be empowered and have effect and impact on their own condition to be sort of an aberration. This is not about a different narrative. This is about reality. One need only read what the mood, the opposition coalition has written, not about individuals, but about what they have written, what they have stood for. This is the opposition that supported a coup. This is an opposition that went to the street. And let me just suggest that there are tremendous differences inside the opposition itself. That's why they can't agree on the question of the recall election, because back in January, Mr. Capriles wanted to start the recall, but Voluntad Popular from Leopoldo Lopez's and company didn't want the recall. They wanted to calentar la calle, heat up the street, and try to oust Maduro instead. And they waited until April to actually launch a recall, knowing that it can't be completed within the first year. That takes time to approve. So again, we have an opposition that by their own statements is to the right of the present collective political project, and somehow we want to try to construct them into being something they're not. Let me suggest that there is a left opposition in Venezuela, but it's not in the mood. Even yesterday's paper, today's paper, in fact, in Caracas, there's a big debate between Torrealba, the leader of the MOOD, and Capriles Radonsky about whether we're going to proceed with protests, or we're going to proceed with the recall, or we're going to have a constitutional convention. So the right is divided. They essentially don't have a positive project. How will the right wing deal with the dependence on oil? How will the right wing deal with the fact that it hasn't rained in Venezuela for 3 years and hydroelectric dams are empty and electricity is missing, and that's why we don't have water? How will the right wing deal with crime, which is a fun, and the price of oil was $7 a barrel?
Again, we are in conversation with Miguel Tinker Salas and Clifton Ross about the Bolivarian Revolution and the political crisis in Venezuela. Miguel Tinker Salas is a professor of history and Latin American studies at Pomona College. He's author of the book Venezuela, What Everyone Needs to Know. Clifton Ross is a journalist, filmmaker, former supporter of the Bolivarian process of Venezuela. He's the author of the book Venezuela, The Map of the Territory. His forthcoming book is called Home from the Dark Side of Utopia. Clifton Ross, feel free to respond to any of that, but what I really want to do is ask one last question about the referendum, and then kind of move us beyond that to what's happening regionally in the area and how this may be affected by and just connected to other countries. But The referendum that Miguel Tinker Salas talked about, the opposition, and again, it is split. It's not necessarily a unified opposition, and they handed in 1.85 million signatures for a recall referendum. There was a split within the opposition of whether to go that track or not, and hence, from what I read, they somewhat got it in late, and now there's a question if there's not a referendum by next year, that changes the dynamic of what happens.
Well,
anyways, you're shaking your head, so I'm just going to let you jump in.
Well, there's so many different things to respond to here. First of all, my book is called The Map of the Territory, not Venezuela, The Map of the Territory, just in case anybody's interested. But let me just say that Venezuela, as Miguel talked about, was in fact in crisis in 1998, which is why Chavez came to power, and they wanted to try something different. And that is true. That's one place where we could agree. Now, as for the opposition, I think he's made my point for me, which is the opposition is very diverse. It doesn't have a caudillo at the top. It doesn't have a verticalist structure the way the PSUV has a verticalist structure. With a man who comes out of the Socialist League, in fact, the verticalist tendency of the Socialist League in the case of Maduro, a follower of Sai Baba, who has a guru and also follows the leader and sees himself as the reincarnation, essentially, or the son of Chavez, who gets his orders from Chavez in the form of a little bird. This is one of the things that he talked about when he was running for president. Yes, in fact, the opposition is very diverse. It's very divided. It is extremely. They're going to have to work out a lot of different things, and that will come through democratic processes. On the other hand, with the Chavistas, now of course it's not as gross and vulgar as people coming into stores and showing their ID cards, but I would really like community councils. What are these community councils? They're directly under the president. They have no constitutional standing. They're funded by the president. You have to agree to be building the socialism of the 21st century to form a community council. That's part of what Margarita Lopez Maya points out in her book Estado Descomunal. Okay, so these committees have a list of all the people that are a part of the community councils, people who are Chavistas, and they distribute bags of food to them. My friend Arturo, Jose, who just was stood in line for 10 hours the other day on his day to buy food, starting at 3 in the morning, and at 1 in the afternoon the National Guard came and broke up the line, telling everyone there's no food, so he went home empty-handed. I asked him about the CLAPS, and this is documented in a really excellent investigative piece by von Bergen. And he confirmed, yes, in fact, we've got no food from the community councils because we're no longer Chavistas. We no longer support this process. So they're no longer on the list. So it goes to it's patronage again. I mean, the radio stations, the community radio stations, if they step out of line, do you ever hear any criticism of Maduro there? Any criticism of the process except in the most general terms that we need to improve, that we need to make some changes, things like that? Never. That's the way populism works. And so what we're looking at in Venezuela is a populist project with a dead caudillo. And now a man coming to take his place who is incompetent to run the government, can't manage all these diverse forces within the Chavista movement, and in fact throws them out. So there is the left opposition, he's right. Maria Socialista, thrown out because they dared to criticize Maduro. I mean, the problem is that there's no criticism allowed in the PSUV at this point. Hector Navarro, Jorge Giordani, thrown out of the party, essentially thrown out, relegated to the very margins, but who now are talking about the $300 billion that the Chavistas have stolen, they've gone missing from the account. That we're talking about a quarter of the money that came through in oil revenues, disappearing into bank accounts in Andorra and in Spain. And all these Chavistas, where are they living? They're living in Miami now. They don't want to live in Venezuela with all the crime and all the decaying infrastructure. So what we've got is a project that has failed. They're now getting loans from the IMF. The government is now getting loans from the IMF. It's selling all of its gold. It's hollowed out its industries. It's trying to privatize, sell off contracts in the oil fields partnering up with international capitalists, and it's in extreme decay. It can't even feed the people in the country. There is hunger. 30% of the school children are now malnourished. There are children who are dropping out of school because they have no food. The indigenous people are suffering worst of all because they never had any access to anything in the first place.
Miguel Tinker Salas, I won't stop you if you want to respond to anything
I just
there.
don't know where to begin. Because again, I mean, first of all, no IMF loans. Second of all, $300 billion. There was not one Venezuelan of any significance, only two minor officials in the Panama Papers. If you think that if Venezuelan Chavistas had money in U.S. banks, that the government would not be going after them, or that a conservative Spanish government would not be going after them. So where is this miraculous $300 billion hidden in? We hear this all the time. You can keep throwing dirt up against the wall. Eventually some of it will stick. Are there problems in Venezuela? Yes, of course. I'm a very strong critic of Maduro. I'm a very strong critic of corruption and of patronage. I'm a very strong critic of all those issues. But again, let's be clear. There has been an advance done in Venezuela that we did not see in any other country. Why on earth would the U.S. target Venezuela for regime change if it was basically a neoliberal state? That idea is preposterous. The same reason that to talk about the divisions among the opposition. No, the only division among the opposition is whether Leopoldo Lopez or Capriles or Maria Corina Machado becomes president. That's the real difference. And that's what's causing them to have different strategies and what approaches. Because do they really want to govern right now? Do they actually want to govern and only fill in a 2-year period in which they will now impose austerity? Yes, of course. Is there problems associated with dependence on oil? Of course there is. Should they be resolved? Immediately they need to be resolved, but they're not going to be resolved by a right-wing neoliberal conservative opposition that will thrust Venezuela back into the 1990s, into the lost decade, and resume the model that we had previously. The larger question is, where do we go from here? And again, what's on the agenda is not the OAS's effort to isolate Venezuela further, but rather a recall, which is on the table right now in Venezuela.
Clifton, Ross, you'll have a chance here in a moment, but I want to try to move our conversation forward a little bit and begin with Miguel Tinker Salas on this question. Is what's happening in Venezuela connected to what's happening in the region? And I guess one thing I'm thinking of in particular is any connection, do you think, to the impeachment of Dilma Rousseff in Brazil?
I think that there has been a right-wing return in Latin America that has been, first of all, the right wing never left. Okay, let's be clear about it. These were open, political, engaged processes. These were process of change through the ballot box, not the bullet. The guerrilla process was abdicated and had been rejected. So we saw a process of change that began in Venezuela in 1998 with the election of Hugo Chavez, was followed again by the Workers' Party in Brazil and Argentina, and then in Bolivia and Ecuador and Paraguay. These were dissimilar processes, but united by one common sense: a rejection of neoliberalism, rejection of the very premise of privatization and neoliberalism, and a social agenda. Also united by an effort to integrate markets, because one of the solutions for Latin America is not simply to be an exporter of commodity products to the U.S., which makes economies vulnerable, but to actually construct economies in the region, to have a common market, an exchange between the region, a common currency, be able to create those conditions. Obviously, those were the goals. They weren't reached, but again, the